some of what we've heard didn't come out clear. That is natural that we don't know everything as individuals, but when you, from community and by region, they vary. The time of the freeze up and the melt of the ice. So from community to community, the names might vary. For example, Tusaktut in the fall is when they're able to travel more freely between camps, and they will begin to get news from other camps, and that will be early winter is when travel is easier on the ice, so it may vary from region to region, and I know it does vary by region. What we call each of these months or that Tisaktu would be early winter, right after freeze up, and it would have been almost a year before they got any news of other camps and their families. And I do remember that is the way we did live, and that's what we called that month, early fall. Tusaktu is something I can share in regards to getting news from other camps when travel was at its best in the early winter. And I know other people in the room will share more of these observations, and hopefully we will hear what it is referred to in the other regions and in other communities. And I will stop here and listen to your other comments, and and I might grab the microphone again, but these months that you in the summer, when most animals are at their best for clothing material. Thank you. I can sit over here. Okay, you can hear me? Testing. Yeah, the months that are listed here in our language, at least in the Baffin region and the North Baffin, including Iqaluit and Pang, they do fluctuate in the days of being ice free and so on, but we do follow. We have the same terms on most of them. The only difference would be the spring comes a little bit later the further north you go, and so that title of each month would fluctuate and vary from community to community in that sense. But basically, but people took the whole year to preparations, whatever was available, depending on the months or the seasons. For example, in the spring, they would begin to start planning on where they would like to go, if they're going to another community, Iglulik or Pond Inlet. Um, and then they would determine the best time of the year to travel, and they would begin preparations maybe in the spring. They would begin to plan. Today's terms would be roughly April, because that's an ideal time to travel far. And from the early spring of Natyat to Idluid it would be harder to travel by dark team. And then if you have to return from a long trip, you would have to have been home in early spring when it was still safe to travel and that they can return before the conditions worsened, and then Nokai would be when the rivers begin to flow, and that is very hard to travel on land. And so people, our ancestors, made all of their plans, not just harvesting but also travel. And as the seasons change to cold winter, am I going too fast? And so in the fall and from the summer, where they will go and gather up that they would use that summer from about late spring, when the seals are basking in the sun and maybe the bearded seals are more available, and all the way to Nukai, people would be caching their catch and their harvest so that they could use that meat in the winter for their dog teams while travel was still available on the ice. And that would take all of that time when the hunting conditions were ideal. This is basically further north where there is less um, dependence on waters, for example, and that's when people begin to stock up for the year in terms of dog food and food for the people and clothing. And then by the time the winter is coming around, they have planned for the whole winter. And I can go on and on too long, but I'm going to stop here. Yes, I did grow up in that generation, but I know Mary knows a little bit more. But when you look at these months, we had a great grandmother, and we basically lived in a small camp. And I was adolescent before we moved to the community, and so our grandmother and our grandfather, they did not refer to the months as we do now. They don't use the word like January, for example, but the seasons of the year, what you see on the board, I'm not sure if it's any better or different. The dead of winter and Tusaktud, they slightly vary, I know, from community to community, region to region. It does depend on when there is freeze up, but then Tusaktud would be when travel is available on the ice in the ocean. I know that much about Tusaktud, that they are getting news from their families and relatives from other camps. And then from the fall in Pond Inlet, we do sit down and just discuss things, and we were sharing that Tusaktud is something we're not practicing now, that we would be sharing news, but the conditions are not right, and so the titles, the timing of these months, traditional months, that the seasons um, would would change from then to now, and if it was one community that has an earlier winter, and if other communities have later winter and so on. So basically, they were also on the conditions of the ice and the snow. I know they will not be exact from community to community. For example, South Baffin and Iqaluit, winter comes later, and then spring comes earlier for Iqaluit. And I know as you go west, I remember Avunit. That's basically referring to the seals. And as far as I know, it's not just on the animals. It also be, for example, a woman who has an early child that is early in the schedule, and that will be the same. Avun is something that will be used as a term for an early birth. And so I guess a lot of these titles may refer to the animals and the environment around us, not just to the people. And so we do practice the titles, and we do try to pass this on to our children, to my kids and my grandchildren, because my wife teaches at the school on the Inuktitut curriculum, and so we do our share of passing on this knowledge. We did have a period of, I guess, a challenge or a nervous time, because people that were coming in and telling us that what you're living is not acceptable. You cannot be a savage or a pagan. You have to convert to Christianity, for example. And so a lot of confidence was lost by the Inuit, and at that time, for example, our children and our grandchildren would be taken care of by the schools. And so at that time, at least in Pond Inlet, a lot of the parents let go of their children and their grandkids, because the school was going to do that job for us. And so the titles and the terms, what you see on the board, was not really practiced for so many years. And I know the Christian community had a lot to do with us losing some of our culture. And while I have the microphone, I know my wife has a cousin, maybe one of the oldest residents of Pond Inlet is her cousin, and she does come around. We feed her as it is acceptable among our people, and we do say, tell us concepts of the Inu Kayume Tukangin, and she always refuses to share, because she was told in those years that she has, I guess, that she is from a generation that lost a lot of their confidence and pride in being Inuit. And so having these terms that are acceptable, that were used by our ancestors, even though they were very useful, will share further the seals and the avunid. And then there is Natiak, the baby seals, the cubs, and there's also that Quonset hut. And so I guess there is a window there. And according to our grandmother, if the sunlight is shining through the window and hitting the bed platform, then that is the time for the seal pups to be born, and she had that down to a science there just from the reflection of the sunlight. Thank you, Madam Chair. Question? I'd like to know. I do remember something slightly different in the Kuwaitan region. Of course, we have all the way down to Alfred. They have birds' eggs available way before any of us in Nunavut. And then when the chicklets are running around, we finally get eggs further north. And so if you have January, for example, or are these months according to the life that they lived in the past, in those years that each month had its own term. So I'm not sure what day would be March, and before the end of March, another, and then we might have another term, and then we might have another month. Now, which month would be used the same as, for example, we didn't have these calendars that we have now, that you have the end of one month, starting of another. And so each month has a title. So were these terms strictly for 30-day period, or how were they confirmed? This is where you are. If it's a 3-month period, or maybe April. So I'd like some clarification on that situation. Someone in the room can respond to that. Is it just by month, or is it the environmental condition that we use those terms that you see on the presentation, January, February, and March? So one term can take more than 1 month of what we have now. Thank you.
Did you want a response? Thank you. My intestine, or rather my umbilical cord is off, but it's not tied. The question that he posed us with respect to the Inuit calendar, the calendar of the day in terms of the year Canadian calendar has not changed. And the calendar of Inuit have not changed. I think if you can look at this in terms of our Inuit knowledge, in terms of a lot easier to think about, because some of them are a little bit behind in terms of the months. What do you think in terms of the calendar? If we look at January, February, for example, are they a little bit behind in terms of the weather? Did you want to reply, or did you have a question? I think earlier somebody was talking about as we are discussing right now, the calendar. I could say that in the Kitilmute region, that calendar, what I've heard from my parents, that we've been told, is that they did not use the calendars what we were told by our parents is that the land, and it's according to the cycle of the land. So we would use the moon, and we would use that if it's a quarter moon. We would be identifying the cycle, like if it's a quarter moon, then we would know what time has passed. And also, we were aware of the environment outdoors, and whenever the weather's going to improve, we would be told that we would be considering that there'll be better days ahead in terms of the where the horizon is in terms of the land. And those are the kinds of things that we factored in to discuss the time. And so for hunting, whenever they were outdoors, that's basically my parents told me that that's how they operated in Khitirmio. That's where I'm from, so that's what we had to rely on. Thank you. I think there's going to be another response to the question. Are you going to respond? I think I'll pass the mic first to the first person who had their hand up. Good afternoon. I'd like to respond to the questions that's at hand. I forgot your name, but I know you very well. My cousin. If we look at the calendar up on the slide, up on the projector, you look at January, February, that's the months back then. What I had come up with is 13 months. And so according to the culture of if you think about Kaumagya, that's because the moon has come out. It's around January. And so if we look at February, here in the southern region, it's a little bit different. So we would make reference to the moon. And so we had 13 cycles, but we would have 12 months. So that's a little bit different in in how Inuit identified the time and how we broke it up. And there's the 13 times where the cycle is different. I don't know if I'm making it clear, but that's how I wrote it down. I believe there was 13 up there, but I think that there was one word missing up in the slide. So one of them didn't come out. The one that's in Roman orthography has caused where there's no room on the slide. So I believe there's some syllabics, and well, nevertheless, I think you'll get the answer. I didn't really think about the content in terms of each name, each title of the time of the year, but I think we were trying to get the idea of in the past in terms of how Inuit were related to the activities of the land. And so I think what I wanted to hear from you more is that what did you think about how Inuit were connected? So, because we had a very intimate relationship with the environment, our land, so I was trying to find that more from you. Well, I had a question with the question. So, like we know in June, there's eggs. So, there's that we know that, for example, I know we are fellow people who live in the north, like in Akbet, like in Pond Inlet. We don't have eggs. Some of the fowl that are not around in Akbet, for example, are not around in Pond Inlet. And Qikirtaluk region in Penlaktu, for example, it's a little bit different maybe. The terms that they might use, but I believe the language might have to be a little bit thought about. And Tungavik representative had a question as to whether or not the Roman orthography is sufficient and or leave it as it is. I love seal meat, especially baby seals, and whenever it's April, and there's that the name has been there for a long time, and that I had tried to get ready, and it was early morning. We left, and I left with my grandchild, and
Payoarui. Uteksunu. Taman.
So it's clean out there, and we noticed that the conditions are different because we didn't see any seal pups in their dens. And so when I'm thinking, the terms of these months were more for the environment, and so there's no way you can adapt these terms to any particular calendar month, and so that got me thinking that a lot of the Inuit is if we go back to that way of life, we would use those months, and so April for us is the seal pups time, and talking to my wife when upon our return, the terms of each month, they do not occur at the same time from community to community. I think maybe we do need to go back to using those terms again. Thank you. Yes, this is very interesting for me. And going back to that first comment, to be early winter, from what I have been taught, is in the fall when the ice forms is when we begin to travel longer distances, and they would go from camp to camp and start inquiring about the conditions of the individuals to bring the news back to the community, their camp. And so to that term for me, in my case, is getting news updates from other camps and relatives. I know it would vary from community to community. For example, those of us in the high Arctic would have a later fall than the rest of Nunavut. And then you have Avunit, early spring. That's for some, that will be February for most of us. And in my formative years around Pond Inlet, the baby seal pup season uh, doesn't occur at the same time as Pond Inlet and Igloolik, and then Igloolik was basically the same terms that were used, but again, the timing is slightly different. And then you have, and it does happen that you still have the species that were there are still around. I'm in the same boat as Charlie, next to me here, and I did love the seal pups, harvesting them, and I will be the middle of April, as far as I know, and I know in the Kuwait, and the timing will be quite different. Now, if we can find some common ground, for me, would be a great challenge for us in this room. If we go back to using those terms, because the wildlife actually revolves around the seasonal cycles, and when they do have the time to migrate, for example, if the winter is going to come in earlier than normal, then the birds would begin to migrate earlier than anticipated. So basically, the terms you see on the board is on the environment and the wildlife. So even with the climate change, we could still have those terms. And then when I lived in Igloolik, or moved to Igloolik, I did realize that, for example, the walrus, they would only have their young in the spring. And once I moved there, I started going to the flow edge and so on. And then I was so scared of those conditions before, but then I began to enjoy them. For example, in March, the walrus begin to come closer to the community of Igloolik, for example, even with their young, even in very extreme conditions. And so you have the spring for most. So it's basically relating to the environment and the climate and the seasons. And so when the seasons fluctuates, so with these terms that you see on the board, and so Tusaktut is, as far as I understand, slightly different in terms of weeks for the territory and getting news from other camps and your relatives. Thank you. You. Yes, we did grow up in different places, and then you have Kaumagiak, looking at those terms, and that's after the dark season, when it begins to get more light. Basically, that's an environmental term. People would begin to celebrate that there will be brighter days ahead, more successful hunting, especially in the further north. That I know Kaumagiak will be a time of celebration for our people, and that month you will be able to harvest more species and the condition they're in. So the Kalmagyak would come with a different species of animals that will be more readily available according to the migration of the animals. So the term Kalmagyak basically, like the polar bears, the snow condition, they would have their den through this Kalmagyak. And then things we would follow and observe, it will become a question whereby today, because the animals seem to have changed the time of their behavior, the migration, and so on. And so, even if a lot of these terms are related to the environment and the conditions of the seasons, and so what I can foresee is a small group discussion to try to come up with better terms that will be more widely available, because from community to community they would vary in terms of the timing. And so even though they used a lot of the same terms, it would not be the exact dates from community to community, as we heard earlier that because we don't use these terms anymore, and a lot of us have not lived through them before governments came up. The behavior of the species, the environment, the seasons, and the any behavior are all changing. You also have the big game and the small game that also differ from region to region. Yes, that is what we're anticipating. What your observers. We do have a time issue here, and break time is coming up.